Now, there's a paradox to all of this. You could say that in one way of speaking, the polar opposite of one-pointed or working with mu would be shikantaza, which is essentially what I call natural meditation. But the funny thing is they end up in the same place. They both end up with a very poignant, clear, unmistakable absorption until it's realized that that absorption is reality itself. Now, this can take many years to recognize, but it is the case in my experience. As it should be, right? What we're engaging here is the question of reality, ultimately. What is unfabricated? That's what we're working on here. What is it that's unfabricated? One approach to that is to look into fabrication. Why do we fabricate? How do we fabricate? And what is it that's fabricated? Well, what is it that's fabricated is peeled off in layers. Certainly. Kind of like a set of nested perceptual filters. And the first major fabrication that we encounter is that of mind identification. We're fabricating a self made out of thought, a separate self, a struggling self, a confused self, a doubting self, a fearful self, an anxious self. And we're putting a lot of energy into doing that. We're putting a lot of energy into continuing to convince ourselves that this is real. This thought-based world is real. That's a whole lot of fabrication. That's a lot of ongoing fabrication. It's a lot of fabrication that we're actually consciously participating in without fully realizing it. Again, this is why that first shift is often such a big relief, because we realize that we don't have to constantly struggle to keep ourselves real. That wasn't real. The struggle was based on a misperception. We can just relax. And we do. We relax significantly after that first shift. It's not the end, it's the beginning of the whole unbinding process, but it's a big deal in that way. Yeah, and that's like I said, so much relief because there was so much fabrication going on. It was this kind of obsession with constantly trying, at least in my experience it was, constantly trying to refabricate this self in such a confusing way. I didn't even know what it was, but it was so much thought and so much energy just being constantly directed into thought to keep something afloat that was just suffering, really. It's really just feeding the fuel of suffering constantly without realizing I'm fully realizing I'm doing it. To have that stop is big. Then the fabrications get more subtle. They're more subtle and they're a little more fixed, I guess. They're a little more you have to dig for these others a little bit, I think. And they're not the kind of thing that we're putting this tremendous amount of energy into constantly. But it is along those lines in that we are putting energy into keeping the fabrication going, but it's much, much less energy. And again, they're more subtle and they're more hidden perceptual filters. So the more subtle fabrications are often overlooked. Even I'm reasonably confident many people have an initial awakening and don't actually dissolve the deeper perceptual filters in that same lifetime, which is fine, but it's mostly because they're subtle, I think. But the more subtle perceptual filters are have to do with reactivity, have to do with agency, have to do with duality, have to do with temporality, and ultimately the fundamental self mechanism or fundamental tendency towards selfing. So they're just filters. They are just fabrications. They are also, at least the more fundamental ones, almost certainly necessary to grow up and develop a normally function sensorium and nervous system and persona and so forth. I'm not sure mind identification is totally normal or totally necessary to function, but certainly the ability to perceive space, distance, and so forth is important. So there's a reason, I suppose, that we form these for adaptability to our environment. But strangely, once we've grown up and developed the ability to function in an apparent three-dimensional environment, we can actually deconstruct them again, and it works. So it's kind of strange that way, but it does. And it's also why it's often very surprising for people, specifically non-dual, when the dualistic perceptual filter in the environment drops. Dualistic experience of the environment, when that drops, it's often rather surprising and funny to see, like, there's not solid reality. Clearly, there's not solid reality right in front of you. And then it's like, then you know what I mean when I say it's right in front of your face, you know. I did a video recently, maybe it hasn't released yet, but it's a quote from the Gospel of Thomas where Jesus says, if you see what's in front of your face, then what's hidden will be revealed to you. Something like that. And I thought it was so funny reading that. It's like so obvious what he's talking about. At the same time, belief is strong, right? Thoughts aren't really that strong. And even the perceptual filters aren't really as dense as they seem. But belief is strong. Belief is strong for some reason. It has that solidifying effect. That's why I wrote a whole chapter on belief and why I talk about belief so much. Because belief is sneaky, and it's like the I don't know what you call it, the mortar between the bricks. You could say the thoughts are bricks or something like that, but without the mortar, there's no wall there, right? The belief is like the mortar. It's always trying to re-solidify. So that's why we can have some belief shift, and then all of a sudden we've adopted spiritual beliefs, or we can even adopt beliefs around earlier spiritual insights. So like we can have had an awakening and develop really distorted beliefs around that. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but it does on occasion. They can get really weird too. You can get kind of grandiose beliefs and some really weird stuff around that. But that's the challenge of belief itself, is it's like fluid in a way. It's adaptable. You can see fully through it. I'm sure of that. At least to the degree where you see that there's nothing about identity or physical reality that is defined by belief, that is approachable by belief, that is discoverable by belief, that is maintained by belief. You can see through that totally. You'll still have beliefs in the relative world. Like you'll still see that in the relative, there are beliefs that are valuable, and there are certainly beliefs that are more true than others. That's the relative world. But you will know the difference between that and actually like really believing a belief or believing that there's someone that holds the belief. That's what it really comes down to. And that can be completely elucidated. It can be completely clear with the subtle self-structure dropping away. But you have to see through, for that to happen, you have to see through the fundamental illusions of time and space. Time, space, agency, form. Yeah. So I've kind of described various stages of this process and how they relate to belief, and and in a sense how they relate to absorption. I think those two components are both important. Absorption being direct investigation of the nature of presence itself, as I talked about in the guided meditation this morning. Absorption first into consciousness, which is a huge discovery. Often it's not even fully clear how to do that after an initial awakening. Although an initial awakening is contingent upon that, it's not always clear the mechanism until later on. But it's a huge discovery when you realize that the access to unbound consciousness is always there, and it can soften anything. It can dissolve anything ultimately with enough practice. Any fixation, any vasana, any belief structure, any tension in the system. That's huge. That's absorption in consciousness. And then, and actually, that initial absorption is absorption in consciousness. That's why we often talk about closing the sense gates and focusing in a one-pointed way on the experience of I, or the experience of identity, or mu, let's say, however you're approaching the first shift. That absorption in consciousness, that's really your entry point. That is the first gateless gate. And when it's clear enough, when the absorption is clear and complete enough, the shift just happens. Beyond that, absorption into the nature of and nature and fluidity of presence itself is usually accessible. That would be like natural meditation. And that's a very, very valuable practice. It's also a practice of life as usual, just moving through day-to-day life and being absorbed into the flow of life without trying to step back from it. This is valuable practice. And then when we're directly confronting the perceptual filters that create the illusion of form and perception and subject and object, in the reverse order, actually, if you're talking in terms of fetters. But when we're confronting those or investigating those, absorption is key. Like if you can't stay absorbed in the visual field for more than 1 second without starting to think about it, without analyzing, right, then it's very challenging to get to the crux of the illusion of duality. So absorption becomes key in those investigations as well. And what allows that absorption is often work in reactivity. It doesn't have to be that way, but it's helpful in that it calms the mind, calms the tendency to react to everything, to push and pull on your experiences, internal and external. Calming all that down allows us to become absorbed in a more peaceful way, in a simple way. So that absorption is very important along this path. And then the other side of the coin is beliefs, as I was talking about. It's critical that you not only, let's say, focus on or engage what is real, what is clear, what is present, what is already here, presence in all of its forms. But the other side of the coin is engaging or challenging what it is that's creating the falsity. What is it that's obscuring it? So in my opinion, in my experience, both of those sides are important. And if you only weigh in on one side or you only practice one side of it, it can be a hindrance. So it's still important to question your beliefs about things, right? Question the fundamental beliefs, question the beliefs about what you're reacting to, question the beliefs about who you are, question the beliefs about time, question the beliefs about space in indirect experience, and really seeing the effect it has to question those beliefs in immediate experience. So I think both of those sides are important with this kind of work, and that's why I talk about both. That absorption in and of itself may not be enough, and questioning, curiosity, challenging beliefs in and of itself may also not be enough. If I was going to err on one side or the other, I would err on the side of inquiry early on, for sure. But absorption becomes extremely important later on. So you need both, I think. I think it's like that. Early on, I think inquiry is probably more important, and absorption is not quite as important. You can cross that first threshold without absorption, probably, or it'll happen right at the end with like a really, really directed inquiry. But the inquiry itself can become absorption, as I was talking about at the beginning. Towards the end, towards the deeper stages of realization, absorption becomes really, really important, I think. And inquiry is also important, but by then you know how to do it. So both of these aspects of practice are important, and I'll, as I always do, point to both sides of this in the guided meditations and the talks and so forth. I was talking to somebody in Q&A yesterday, and I made this point that if you're inclined toward resting in presence, resting in your natural experience and just flowing with that, and it's very easy for you to do, it's important to always keep in mind that at some point in your journey, you may really need to do some very directed inquiry, because what can happen is you can kind of hide things from yourself without realizing it. So inquiry is kind of what keeps you honest. Or at least it helps you to see what you have habituated to not seeing, or what your patterns have habituated to hiding, shadow work, essentially. So inquiry can be a really, really good way to get into that shadow, to find what's being overlooked, to find what you're bypassing, really through no fault of your own. It's just the way we're set up. When we have a setup to have a dualistic experience, then we're also set up to have a shadow experience. So inquiry is really good for that. But as I mentioned, some people, I think, are almost too analytical, and then inquiry becomes something more superficial and analytical, and there can actually be kind of a fear of absorption. There can be a fear of completely plunging, completely letting go into your immediate experience without being up here in the safe space of thought and analysis. So you can err on both sides, but when they both come together, it's like magic. It becomes very powerful when those two are infused. The absorption into experience and the query, the question. Which can, of course, evolve. The question does evolve. Early on, a question like, who am I? What is mu? What is this? What is suffering? These kinds of questions. Later in realization, a question like, do I actually find a boundary? Do I find a dividing line between a subject and an object? Oh, someone's got a puppy dog. I'm watching someone pet their dog. Cute. Yeah, and specifically to these non-dual contemplations, when we're confronting the subject-object experience or appearance, it can be really helpful to start with absorption. So for instance, in the visual field, start with the absorption into the visual field, seeing how long you can actually just remain in that visual with no analysis, no descriptions, no labels, no objects. And as you are able to stay there longer and longer, then you have more opportunity to ask the question in that context, the context being the visual experience itself. So we want to ask the question remaining in that context, not looking for a thought answer. If we don't have the absorption first, what'll happen is we'll ask the question, but we'll immediately go to the mind looking for the answer because we never left the mind. We never left the thoughts. You got to get out there. You got to get into the pure sense experience, the visual. And often that will feel like being swallowed up, or can be very fearful for the initial experience of it, like almost like you're being overtaken or completely being replaced by something. So it is that kind of full-on surrendered, feminine movement of complete absorption.